I thought there for a moment that Chris was going to have you stand through my entire lesson. We had a young man. He had graduated from college, and he led singing for us one time this last year. It was his first time at Memorial Road, and he led the first song or two. We always stand on the song where everybody's still coming in, you know. And he decided to go ahead and lead the next couple of songs with everybody supposedly still coming in. And then he had people stand during the next song and the next song, all the way till it was time for me to get up and speak. So we stood through the entire song service. Now, I know a lot of young people appreciate that. They enjoy standing and singing. For us who are not quite as young, we don't mind sitting down after the first song. Matter of fact, once you come in the back door, you find your seat, you sit down, you'd be happy just to stay there, right? You don't have to stand up and sit down and stand up and sit down. It's perfectly okay. When Chris invited me to speak tonight, and he told me the topic, I thought, well, he decided to ask the oldest person he could to come and speak. Go while you are still able. So, I'm here, and hopefully I will do okay. It made me, first of all, remember a particular time in my life, back in 1997. Our youngest son wanted to go on a program called Trek, and it's a hiking adventure in Colorado. They have a guided hike up a 14,000-foot mountain. And I thought about it, and I thought, oh, I could go along with them. But then I decided, no, I'm not going to do that this year. Next year, he wanted to go once again. And by that time, my knees were beginning to bother me a little bit, and I thought, there's no way I can go up that mountain and back down once again. I didn't go while I was able to, and so I've never been on that particular program. But as I thought about our lesson tonight, I did think, of course, about age. We need to do things before we get too old, before we are incapable of going, or just have a hard time going. But at the same time, I know there's a wide variety in the audience, and those of you that are part of the youth group, you probably couldn't care less about hearing about go while you're able. You've got your whole life in front of you, or at least it appears that you have your whole life in front of you. You're going to be able to go and do and, you know, take adventures and go all kinds of places and go wherever you want to go and do whatever you want to do. For some of us, that's not going to be the case. But I want to make the lesson a little bit broader. And so I want to do two things, first of all. First of all, I want to talk about going. You know, when the Lord called disciples to follow him, he wasn't just asking them, stay behind me, and wherever I go, you go. He was calling them to follow him and learn from him and learn to be like him. To do the things that he did, to think the way that he thought. Many times we talk about Christians being Christ-like. And one of the things I've always thought of is if we're going to be Christ-like, first of all, we have to learn to think like Christ. In Philippians chapter 2, that's basically what that's about. You know, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Paul's writing to Philippian brethren about humility. Christ was humble. You want to be a good servant? Learn to be humble. Christ was humble. And so many other times the apostles, as they write in their epistles, they try to remind people of Jesus. You remember the one that has called you. You remember the one who has died for you. You remember the one that you are to imitate in your life. Well, if you're going to be like him, you need to learn to think like him. And so when Jesus called his disciples to follow him, he wanted them to become like him in all aspects. Now, yes, we can't, perform miracles the way that he did. And there's some other things we probably can't do the way that he did. But overall, we can imitate Christ. Matter of fact, Paul, as he writes to the Corinthian brethren, he challenged them by saying, imitate me as I imitate Christ. He wasn't just saying imitate me the way I am, but imitate me in the way that I imitate Christ. And that's what he wants each one of us to do, to be as much like Jesus, to take on the image of Jesus Christ, to be like him. You remember the words of Paul in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, where he said, I'm not ashamed, of the gospel. Well, I'm not ashamed to be of the gospel of Christ, he mentions in Romans, in Galatians 2:20. He mentions, it is no longer I that live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Jesus living in us. So Jesus called his disciples, including us, to follow him. But if we're going to follow him completely, one of the things we're going to have to learn to do is to go. Because he was always going, wasn't he? Matter of fact, he left the glories of heaven. 2 Corinthians 8 verse 9 talks about how he left the riches of heaven and came to earth and took on the form of man. He left heaven. He went, didn't he? And as Jesus carried out his ministry, how many places did he go? You remember how many trips he makes back and forth between Jerusalem and Galilee, and the stops that he often would make? He was always going and doing. He didn't just come to earth, say, okay, I'm going to set up an office in Jerusalem. If anybody's interested, y'all come to me. He went to the people, didn't he? And throughout the gospel accounts, you see Jesus out among the people. One of the lessons that I kind of took upon myself, or one of the just personal Bible studies that I've done, is to go through the Gospels and mark. I happen to do it in light blue, but to mark every time the word crowd or multitudes are used. Crowds and multitudes. You would be astonished at how often the crowds were around Jesus. When we think about the Jews and their relationship with Jesus, many times we think, well, they were all against him. They put him to death. But you go back and look at the gospel accounts. It wasn't the Jewish people in general. It was those that were the leaders, the ones that should have known better. Because the crowds are always around Jesus. You think about the story of Zacchaeus, for example. Zacchaeus is one of short stature, but he wants to see Jesus. But he can't see Jesus because of the crowds that are following Jesus. So he climbs the sycamore tree. And Jesus stops and takes notice. Or you think about when Jesus enters Jerusalem for that final time, how the people thronged the sides of the street, how they put down the palm branches in their cloaks, and as he was coming into town, they shouted, hallelujah. Jesus was always out among the people. And tonight, as we think about go, I want us to think about be out among the people. Be outside of yourself. A lot of times when we look at the Great Commission or we think of go, we think of go to a foreign field, go to another state, go to another part of this state, be involved in a VBS or a meeting or some kind of campaign. But really, when Jesus calls upon us to go, he wants us simply to go outside of ourselves. Maybe go outside of ourselves to one of our family members, to reach out to them, or to our next door neighbor, or to a coworker, or a fellow student, or just somebody that you come into contact with. Jesus didn't call us to hoard the gospel. He didn't ask us to put it in a reservoir. He didn't ask us to, I want you to believe, but I don't ever want you to tell anybody else about this. I want you to practice it. I want you to practice it in everyday life. You remember in Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, when he writes about being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. He wants our lives to shine, doesn't he, in a world of darkness. That's what he did. John chapter 1 makes mention of the fact that in the beginning was God, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. You drop down to verse 14, and you see he's talking about Jesus. But in that same chapter, he talks about being a light in the midst of darkness. How dark was the first century? We look at our society today, especially in America, and especially for those of us that have been around a while, we just kind of shake our heads and how much worse can it get? Go back and read some history of the first century. Go back and see how deplorable it was back then. And Jesus was a light in a world of darkness. He came into his own, and his own received him not. But he came and he let his light shine. We sing the song, this little light of mine. It's a great song. We teach that in BBS. We sing it all together. But that ought to be, in one sense, a motto for all of us. Let my light shine all throughout the neighborhood. Let this little light shine. I may not be a beacon. I may not be a spotlight, but I am a light. I walk in the light, right? And I walk after the one that said that he is light in a world of darkness. So when we think of the idea of go, that can be pretty open. When Jesus gave the Great Commission, he didn't tell the apostles, I want you to go to Egypt, I want you to go to Syria, I want you to go here, I want you to go there. He didn't tell them where to go. He just said go. And he didn't tell them exactly when to go. Matter of fact, they seem to wait for several years. They stay in Jerusalem and they concentrate in Jerusalem and then begin to go. But they finally do go. And when he says go and tells his disciples to go, he really, even for the ones that go off later, he doesn't say to them, I want you to go tomorrow. He just says go. And did that mean they weren't supposed to do anything until they went? No. They go outside of themselves, outside of their group, and they taught in Jerusalem. They went in Jerusalem first. And then according to Acts chapter 1, they not only go throughout Jerusalem, but then they go through Judea, the Christians do. They go through Samaria, and then they go to the uttermost parts of the world. So when you think of the idea of going while you're able, let me encourage you to think of that as simply going outside yourself, reaching out to others. It doesn't have to be a big trip. It can be next door. But share the gospel message with other people. And then there's the part, and we're going to go beyond this, but there's also the part, about while you are able. And of course, when I first heard that, I immediately began thinking of age. I'm not young anymore. There are a lot of things I can't do that I used to do, and we do need to work while we can and do what we can, while we can. But does that mean that, one day will come when we'll never be able to do anything? Well, that could happen. But there are things that can interfere with our going. Let's say for a moment I want to go. I want to go to a foreign country. I want to go to another state. I want to do whatever. But my parents, they need care. And I'm the primary caregiver. I don't have time to go. Or maybe you develop an illness. You want to go, but you've got an illness and there's no way you can go and do that anymore. And there's so many other things that we could look at. But what I want us to think about tonight is, while you're able to go, we all are able to go anytime. I mean, unless you're in a coma or something of that nature, we all can go. We don't have to go physically. You can text somebody. You can FaceTime somebody. You can actually write an old-time letter, put it in the mail. You can make phone calls. There are a lot of things you can do. Now, you may not always be able to go and do what you want to do, but there's always something you can do. Tom Conklin, who is our seniors minister at Memorial Road, I was talking to him one day, and he said the most often asked question he gets from the older members there is, what can I do? What can I do? And so he keeps a list of 20 things that anybody and everybody can do, which includes the phone calls and the letters and the texts and so on. Not to mention prayer. Everybody can pray, can't they? They can pray for the work of the Lord, pray for the church, pray for the leaders, the Bible class teachers, the youth group, so many other things, missionaries. We all can do something. We may not be able to go physically where we want to go, but we can revamp our goals and the things we are able to do. Several years ago, when I was in high school, I decided that I wanted to do mission work. And the congregation I grew up in was the Riverwood congregation in Nashville, Tennessee, and every summer we went on summer mission trips. And so we went to Cherokee, North Carolina a couple of years. We went to Ithaca, New York a couple of years. We went to Lynchburg, Virginia. And I guess that just kind of helped instill in me a desire to do mission work. Then I went to Harding University. And one week during my senior year, there were 3 missionaries that came within a 2-week period of time. Glenn Owen, Howard Norton, and Otis Gatewood. And all 3 of them talked about team mission work. Howard and Glenn both had been part of the Sao Paulo mission team. Otis, of course, did mission work in Europe. But all 3 talked about doing team mission work. So 3 of my friends and myself, we got together and decided we wanted to be a team. And we wanted to go somewhere. And since we had some connection, therefore, with Howard and Glenn, we decided we'd go to Brazil. And so during our Christmas break of our senior year, we flew to Brazil. First time I'd been on an airplane. But we flew down there and we looked at 3 or 4 locations and decided a particular area we wanted to go to in Sao Paulo, the district of Lapa. And then after our graduation, we all 4 had ministry jobs. We made plans for going to Brazil in like 4 years. But during those 4 years, the other 3 dropped out, them and their wives. So it was just me and my wife. So we hooked up with the Sao Paulo mission team, which was already there. There were 16 families there. I understand Carol Vincent comes here. Carol and Don, they were part of that group. They left right before we arrived. They left like in the spring. We arrived in the fall. But we've visited time and again since then. And so we joined up with them and we did mission work. And as far as we were concerned, we were there to stay for ages. The team, they were trying to recruit what they called a second wave, some to come in and help do some things as some of the first ones began to come back. And so as they were recruiting, they asked everybody for a 5-year commitment. And Joy and I are like, that's fine. You know, we plan to stay longer than 5 years. We have no problem with 5 years. Just an interesting little side note, there was another family that came the next year, Brian and Jacqueline Bost. Brian and Jacqueline said, we're going to stay 5 years, no more, not a day longer. Well, after the 4th year, or as the 4th year began, our daughter, who was born in Brazil, had some issues, medical issues come up. We had to return before the 5 years even arrived. Brian and Jacqueline wound up staying in Brazil 40 years. 40 years. But they too now have come back and they live in Edmond, same place we live. But that was our plans, and now all of a sudden, you know, that's what we want to do. We went. We wanted to go, we went. And then because of our daughter's health, we had to come back. So everything was shuffled, changed. Well, what do you do? Do you give up on ministry? Do you give up on serving? Well, we just looked for a different area. I wound up working as an educational minister first. Then we moved to another congregation. I was associate minister, but basically that was education and youth. And then we moved to Oklahoma, and I began preaching at the Pauls Valley congregation in 1989. Stayed there 12 years and then moved on to Durant. But I tell all that to say, okay, we wanted to go. And we had plans. And our plans were to stay for life, maybe. But we couldn't. We weren't able to stay there. So what do? Well, you find a different area to serve in. You find a different area that you can work in. You look at your talents, you look at opportunities, and you decide, here's the best way I can serve the Lord. And that's what we did. And that can be true with everybody. You know, so when you think of going, while you're able, you know, the able part can change for a lot of reasons. But it doesn't mean you can't serve anymore. Doesn't mean you can't go in other ways. Doesn't mean you can't do ministry in other ways. You know, you may need to stop and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12 or Romans 12. Both of those talk. Paul gives the illustration of the church being like a body. You know, there are many members, but there's one body. And he makes mention of the fact that, you know, every person has talents, different responsibilities, different opportunities. And you just have to look at yourself sometime and determine what it is you can do and want to do and how you could best serve the Lord. Well, as you think about going outside of yourself, while you are able, anytime, what's required to be a good servant of the Lord? Well, let me mention 4 things real quick. First of all, you've got to have desire. You've got to have a desire to serve the Lord. You know, in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19, it mentions that God is love and that we love him because he first loved us. We love him because he first loved us. Let me ask you if you think that also could apply with Jesus. Do we love Jesus because he first loved us? Well, yeah. He left heaven. He came to earth and lived among men as a man. He died a cruel death on the cross. There's no doubt that he loved us. He did that before we were even born. If you look at Romans chapter 5, you remember in the first 10 verses that Paul writes to the Roman brethren there, and he points out that while we were sinners, while we were ungodly, while we were enemies of God, he sent his son Jesus Christ into the world to die for us. God loved us before we loved him, but we love him because of that. Jesus left the glories of heaven. Jesus died on the cross for us. He arose for us. He's seated at the right hand of God, mediating for us now. He loved us before we were born. Do we love him in return? Well, I hope so. And if we love him in return, will we not desire to serve him? In John chapter 14, verse 15, John 15, verse 14, Jesus points out to his disciples, he said, if you are my friends, if you're truly my friends, you'll obey me. You'll do my will. And then he turns around and he says, you know, that if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Both of those points. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. He has commanded us to go. But we don't go just because we're commanded to. We go because we love him and we love what he's done for us. We have a desire to go. This afternoon I was talking to Chris and Dylan, and one of the things I mentioned, one of my favorite passages is in Mark chapter 5. It's the story of the Gadarene demoniac. You remember the Gadarene demoniac, he's in the cemetery. The townspeople have exiled him there. They've tried to chain him, but he's broken the chains. Town people don't want to have anything to do with him. Jesus goes to the cemetery, walks over, heals him. The people hear and they go out to check on him, and now he's seated, clothed and in his right mind. And Jesus is ready to depart and go to the next point. And the Gadarene demoniac, he asked Jesus, can I go with you? I want to go with you. And Jesus says, no. You know, that seems a little odd to us. I'm glad that you want to follow us. Come on, go with us. But instead, Jesus tells the Gadarene demoniac, you go back to the people you know. Go back to your hometown, and you tell them what I have done for you. Tell them what I've done for you. Let me ask you tonight, what has the Lord done for you? Have you ever stopped and thought about that? If you never have, let me encourage you to sit down with a sheet of paper and a pen sometime and just think through, what difference has Jesus made in my life? And you'll immediately start thinking of things. You'll be able to fill that page probably without any problem. But you'll think about, well, my sins are forgiven because of Jesus. Or Jesus has giving me purpose in my life. So many people in the world today are longing for a purpose. I don't know how many young people I see. They don't really have a purpose in life. And it's tough that way. They don't have a reason to live. You watch football players, and football players are the ones I always think of, but you just watch some of the athletes. And especially if you talk to the ones that have played the sport already and now are no longer playing the sport, what are you going to do now? I have no idea. That's because their life was wrapped up in the sport. But if your life is wrapped up in Jesus Christ, you've got purpose. It doesn't matter what happens in the world. It doesn't matter how dismal the world looks. You've got a purpose. You've got a reason to live. You've got a reason to be an example to others. You want to share with others the love that you have for Jesus Christ, who has made such a difference in your life. So stop and think about that sometime. But first of all, you have to desire to go. Now, I know Myron spoke a few weeks ago about opportunities. Seize the opportunities you have, and you need to do that, of course. But you have to have a desire if you want to seize those opportunities. If it doesn't matter to you, if the soul of the individuals around you don't matter, or if living a Christian life doesn't matter, or being a shining light doesn't matter, you're not going to go. But if you desire to show your love for the Lord and His love for you and the difference He has made in your life, then you're going to want to go. You're going to have a desire. The second thing I would mention is have a willingness. Occasionally you come across people, they want to go, they want to do good things, but they're just not willing to make the sacrifices or give up the time or give the energy or do something that would take away from their own pleasure. You've got to be willing to go. Think about Jesus. Was He willing to leave heaven and come to earth? Or did He have to do that because God says you need to go to earth? No, He willingly left, didn't He? And I always think about, that final night in the garden. The mob comes. Peter's ready to fight. He pulls his sword, he cuts off that ear of Malchus. Jesus says, put it away. If He wanted to, He could have called in angels, couldn't He? Legions of angels. But He willingly allowed them to take Him really to His death. Or you think about on the cross. He's suspended on the cross. And some of the people are standing around mocking. If you are the Son of God, come down from there. Prove to us you're the Son of God. Show us you're the Son of God. Do you think it at least passed through Jesus' mind? Oh, I would love to. I'd love to just come right down off of there and show you who I really am. But He willingly stayed on the cross. He willingly died that cruel death. We need to be willing to give up some of our own time, to give up some of our energy, maybe some of our resources, and go. And go while we can. The third thing I would mention is open your eyes. In John chapter 4, Jesus takes His disciples, and they're headed from Jerusalem up to Galilee, and they go through Samaria. That wasn't the normal path. They many times would go around Samaria, but He said we must needs go through Samaria. He had a reason to go through Samaria. And they come to a well, and He sends His disciples off. They haven't eaten, so they go into town in order to get food. Jesus stays there at the well, and He meets the Samaritan woman. And according to the culture of that day, He wasn't supposed to talk to a Samaritan, number one. He wasn't supposed to talk to a woman. Some argue her background, character. He definitely wasn't supposed to talk to her. But there Jesus sat, and He asked her for water. And then He taught her about the living water. She goes into town and she tells the whole town, here's a man that's told me everything I've ever done. Could this be the Christ? And the town comes out and they listen to Jesus and they hear what he's got to say, and even more of them believe, or their faith in him is strengthened. And then the disciples come back and they're kind of astonished. What are you doing talking to Samaritans of all things? And especially this woman over here. Why are you talking to her? And in reply, Jesus, part of the reply is, open your eyes. The fields are white unto harvest. The fields are white unto harvest. What fields? Were they in the middle of farmland? Possibly. We don't know. That wasn't what he was talking about, was it? He's saying, look at all of these Samaritans that have come out. They've come out because they have heard that I may be the Messiah. They've come out and been more convinced because of the things they've heard. Here's your field. Now, if Jesus had just led the apostles into Samaria and say, run out there and teach everybody, would they have done that? Go to Samaritans? Are you crazy? But here Jesus is saying, look, they're willing to listen. They're interested. You have a lot of people in the world today that say people are losing interest in Jesus. Nobody cares anymore. That's not true. The fields are white unto harvest. And you don't have to go to Brazil. You don't have to go to Africa. You don't have to go to India. People in our own world are white unto harvest. They're looking for something better than what they have. They're looking for a better way, a better society. They're looking for a Savior. Just like, the people of the first century, they had heard about a Savior coming for years, decades, centuries. And here he was, and the crowds were flocking around. Well, there are people today that want to hear about Jesus. Not everybody, I understand that. But there are a lot of people that want a better life. They want some hope. Right now, on Sunday nights at Memorial, I'm doing a series entitled Hope for a Troubled World. It comes from 1 Peter. Peter's writing to a group of scattered Christians in northern Asia, or northern Asia Minor. Persecution has begun. It's not at its height yet, but he's trying to encourage them to be strong and faithful. And so he writes to them about the living hope. The living hope they have through Jesus Christ, who was raised from the dead. And just as he was raised from the dead, you too, one day can be raised from the dead. Hang on to that hope, he says. Hold on to that. It'll help you through the troubled times, regardless of what's going on in the world. At Memorial, we have a 6-year theme plan. Our theme this year is to follow him, follow Jesus. Our theme for next year, which happens to be the election year, is love one another. Is there going to be any turmoil next year? Is there any political turmoil now? Learn to love one another. You may not agree with everybody, but you can love them. You can show them respect. You can show them kindness. You can treat them the way that they ought to be treated. Because they too have been created by God. They too had a man named Jesus who willingly gave himself for them. And they too have a soul that can go to heaven. But if you're cruel, you're mean, you're rude, are you going to attract them? Or are you going to pull them toward Jesus? Or are you going to drive them away? When you go, you don't have to go far, and you don't have to do fabulous works, but go and do what you can. And then the fourth point is you have to take action. You can have the desire, you can have the willingness, you can even see the problem out there, or you can see how many need the gospel. But if you don't take action, what difference does it make? None. If you don't go, if you don't get outside of yourself, if you don't talk to others, if you don't share with others what Jesus has done for you, is it going to make any difference? No. So you take action. Jesus took action, didn't he? Like I said earlier, he didn't just come, go to Jerusalem, set up a throne there and say, okay, y'all all come here. He was out and about serving them. He came to do the Father's will, and that was the Father's will. But he was always thinking about others. He did say, I didn't come in order to be served, but in order to serve. He still serves us today. He was always thinking about serving, wasn't he? Action. In John chapters 13 through 17, maybe my favorite section of scriptures, Jesus pulls his 12 apostles together to the upper room in order to give them final instructions. It's the last time he's with them before his death. And he takes them there in order to prepare them for his departure. He's already told them he was going to depart. But he reiterates that during this meeting. But how does he start out this meeting with them? He takes a bowl and a towel, and he begins to serve them, to wash their feet. And then he tells them, do as I have done. He wasn't talking about wash each other's feet all the time. He was talking about serving one another, having the humility that you can do that you can reach down, that you can, in a sense, belittle yourself in order to serve someone else. And he continued on that night talking about the things they needed to hear, what I think are the most. He wants them to be prepared. And so he tells them in chapter 14, I'm going away to prepare a place for you. But if I go away, I'm coming again, that where I am, you may be also. He wanted them to understand what was going to take place and that he would be back for them. He was trying to encourage them and uplift them because some difficult times were coming. He was going to be taken. He was going to be crucified, buried in a grave. What do you suppose all went through their minds? Have our last 3 years been for naught? Have we wasted the last 3 years? No, Jesus says, I want you to know this is about to happen because when it happens, you can remember, I told you this was going to happen. And of course, he tells them, I'm coming back for you. Plus, he tells them in that period, I'm going to send the Holy Spirit who will be with you. Or if you ask of me anything, I'll see that you get it. They were going to need to rely on one another. They were going to need to rely on the Spirit. They were going to need to rely still on him. And so he tells them that. And then you come to chapter 17. For a long time, I think I just looked at chapter 17 or just assumed chapter 17 was totally disconnected. But where are the 11 apostles when he offers up their prayer? In his presence. Right there with Jesus. And you'll remember he starts out that prayer and he acknowledges to God that the time has come for him to be glorified and that he is glorifying God. Then he prays for the apostles specifically. But then he prays for all those that are yet to believe. That's you and me. He prayed for us. Jesus Christ, our Savior, prayed for us. How would you like to have been there that night and heard him praying for you? Would that encourage you any? Would that inspire you any? You actually hear Jesus praying specifically for you, and he acknowledges, God, these are in the world, and I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but that you be with them. And God was. And all you have to do is read the book of Acts and see that he definitely was with them. But you have to take action then. And the apostles did, following his resurrection. They took action and they go forth, sharing with others how important Jesus was for them. Let me mention one other story that you may think of this as kind of just an attachment or an appendage or something. But in John chapter 21, Jesus has already told Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. Happens. on that as he's in the garden or in the courtyard there, Peter's asked, aren't you one of them? No, I'm not. He even mentions that he cursed. I'm not. And after the rooster crows the third time, one of the gospel accounts mentions, and Jesus looked at him. Eye to eye. How would you like to deny Jesus 3 times in a row and him look you straight in the eye? Whoa. Which rock can I hide under? Can I bury myself over here somewhere? But Peter didn't. And in John chapter 21, Jesus pulls Peter aside. He has a conversation with him. He says, Peter, do you love me? To which Peter immediately responds, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Peter, do you love me? Yes, sure I do. Peter, do you love me? And sometimes we look at the words, and Jesus uses agape love when he's talking to Peter. Peter responds with another Greek word, phileo, I believe. And we make a big to-do about that, and there may be some significance to that. But as you look at that story, let me ask you to go back and look at it. What does Jesus tell him after Peter's answer each time? Feed my sheep. Tend to my lambs. If you had a sheepfold and you were going to ask someone to take care of it, would you ask somebody you did not trust? No. I think Jesus was asking Peter, do you love me? To get Peter to realize, I really do love you, Lord. Because undoubtedly Peter was questioning that some. Do I really love him? I've betrayed him 3 times here. I've denied him 3 times. But Jesus wanted Peter to understand, yes, I love the Lord. And so Jesus entrusts him and says, tend to my sheep. And you get to the book of Acts, especially the first 11 and 12 chapters. Who's the primary character? Peter. He's the one that directs the others as they select Matthias to replace Judas. He's the principal speaker, at least from a recording standpoint, in chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. He's the one that is taken before the council on a couple of occasions and told not to preach the name of Jesus anymore, and yet he does. He's the first one to go to Cornelius, which represents the idea of the gospel going to the Gentile nation. He was important. He truly did love Jesus. But Jesus had to get him to see that he loved him and how much he loved him. And it strengthened him. And when we study the life of Jesus and the character of Jesus, action's not really going to be a problem. When we come to love Jesus and have the faith in Jesus that we need to, going, not a problem. I'm going to willingly go. I'm going to willingly share with others my faith in Jesus Christ and encourage them and walk with them and love them and exhort them and teach them and all of those one another passages. So as you think about the idea of going while you can, let me encourage you to go outside of yourself. And let me encourage you to find whatever area you need to or can where you can serve and do what you can do and serve the Lord. This afternoon, as Dylan, Chris, and I were talking, Dylan brought up one other point, and I had thought of this, but it's the idea of, we need to go and do what we can while we can, because one day there's a judgment day coming. Judgment is coming, isn't it? It's been appointed unto man once to die, and after this, the judgment. Hebrews 11:27. We all know that one day, either this world will come to an end, or we'll pass from this world. And there will be a judgment day, and we will be called before the Lord. What's going to be our response? In relation to going and doing what we could do, are we going to be able to say, Lord, I went, and here's what I did? Not that that's going to, earn your way into heaven, But will you be able to say, I was a good servant? Will he respond saying, well done, thou good and faithful servant? What will be the instance for you on Judgment Day? Did you go and did you do what you could? We're going to sing a song of invitation. And tonight, if you've never put on Christ in baptism, it's hard to follow him without doing that, without being one of his. So we give you the opportunity to come forward and confess your faith and be baptized into Christ. But maybe you've been a Christian for years, but you've never really gone and done anything. You've never really given yourself wholeheartedly to the Lord, and you want to do that tonight. Or maybe you just want the prayers of the church. Maybe you need encouragement, strengthening. Maybe you're struggling with a particular problem. But whatever the case may be, if you'll come while we stand and sing this song, we'll be happy to assist you.